Flight 427 to Cedar Falls. Emergency descent. Oxygen masks dangling like broken promises above terrified passengers. Row 17. Calloused hands with motor oil still embedded under chipped fingernails gripping armrests that had seen thousands of journeys. The man wearing a faded flannel shirt and work boots sat motionless while chaos erupted around him, his weathered face carved from stone, eyes distant as if he'd already survived worse storms than this. Up in business class, champagne glasses shattered against tray tables. Behind him, a child sobbed for her mother, yet he remained perfectly still, breathing steady, as if mechanical turbulence was nothing compared to the wreckage life had already thrown his way. Then, cutting through screams and prayers, a woman's voice from first class pierced the mayhem. "My God! Is that Mike Thompson?" The Boeing 737 touched down hard on Cedar Falls Regional Airport's single runway, engines screaming in reverse thrust as emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft. Mike Thompson unbuckled his seatbelt with the same methodical precision he used when dismantling transmissions at Murphy's Auto Repair. No wasted motion, no unnecessary drama. Around him, passengers hugged loved ones and wiped away tears of relief. But Mike simply reached for his worn leather duffel bag from the overhead compartment. 3 years of single fatherhood had taught him that survival was just another Tuesday. As passengers filed toward the exit, Mike caught glimpses of the woman who had called his name. Katherine Sterling moved through the crowd like she owned the air itself. Charcoal blazer pressed to perfection, platinum hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She was everything Cedar Falls wasn't. Polished, expensive, untouchable. When their eyes met, for a brief second, something flickered across her face. Recognition mixed with disbelief, as if she'd spotted a ghost wearing work clothes. The terminal buzzed with the controlled chaos of emergency protocols and delayed flights. Mike shouldered his bag and headed toward the parking lot, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But Katherine's voice followed him like an echo from another lifetime. "Mike, wait!" He stopped walking but didn't turn around, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Some conversations were 3 years too late. She approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the rhythm of expensive confidence. Up close, Mike could see the tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the way her fingers worried the edge of her Hermes bag. "You look," she started, then seemed to reconsider her words. "Different." Mike finally turned to face her, and for a moment neither spoke. The distance between them felt like more than just 3 feet of airport terminal. It was the space between 2 entirely different worlds. 3 years changes a lot, Mike replied, his voice carrying the rough edges of honest work and sleepless nights. He glanced at his watch, a battered Timex that had belonged to his father. "I need to get home. Emma's expecting me." Katherine's eyebrows lifted slightly at the mention of his daughter, as if she'd forgotten that life existed beyond quarterly reports and board meetings. But she said nothing as Mike walked away, leaving her standing alone among strangers who would never know they'd just witnessed the reunion of 2 people who had once built empires together. The next morning arrived gray and cold, typical for late October in Iowa. Mike's alarm hadn't sounded yet when he heard the telltale sputter of an expensive engine refusing to cooperate with Midwest weather. Through his kitchen window, he watched a sleek black Mercedes coupe roll to a stop in front of Murphy's Auto Repair, white smoke drifting from under its hood like surrender. The driver stepped out, and Mike's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. Katherine Sterling had found him again. Murphy's garage sat on the edge of downtown Cedar Falls like a monument to simpler times. Brick walls darkened by decades of honest smoke, hand-painted signs advertising services that big city folks had forgotten existed. Mike arrived 10 minutes early, as was his habit, and found Katherine standing beside her disabled vehicle with the particular expression of someone accustomed to problems that money could solve. This wasn't one of those problems. "Car trouble?" Mike asked, approaching with the easy confidence of a man in his element. Katherine turned, and for a moment her corporate composure slipped. She looked almost relieved to see him, though she quickly masked it with professional courtesy. "The engine just started smoking. I was hoping someone here might take a look." Mike nodded toward the service bay, gesturing for her to follow. No mention of yesterday's encounter, no acknowledgement of shared history, just the simple transaction of customer and mechanic. Under the hood, the problem revealed itself immediately. A blown radiator hose, probably stressed by the dramatic temperature change from Chicago's urban heat island to Iowa's autumn chill. Mike's hands moved with practiced efficiency, diagnosing and explaining the issue while Katherine watched with curious intensity. She seemed fascinated by the way he worked, methodical, confident, completely absorbed in the task at hand. This was a side of Mike Thompson she'd never seen in boardrooms and strategy sessions. "It'll take about an hour," Mike said, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "There's a diner across the street if you want to wait somewhere more comfortable." Katherine glanced around the garage, at the vintage car calendars, the coffee pot that looked older than some of the vehicles they serviced, the easy camaraderie between Mike and Murphy. "Actually," she said, "I think I'll stay here, if that's all right." Mike shrugged and returned to work, but Katherine caught the slight smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Some things apparently never changed. That afternoon, Mike sat in the familiar chaos of Emma's third-grade classroom, surrounded by miniature desks and colorful artwork that proclaimed the unbridled optimism of 8-year-olds. Parent-teacher conferences were sacred time in his carefully managed schedule, the 2 hours every month when the outside world had to wait while he focused entirely on his daughter's universe. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, spread out examples of Emma's work with the pride of someone who genuinely loved her job. "Emma's doing exceptionally well in math and reading," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, pointing to test scores that made Mike's chest swell with quiet pride. "But I'm particularly impressed with her creativity. Her latest assignment about personal heroes was quite remarkable." She pulled out a construction paper booklet titled My Hero in Emma's careful cursive, illustrated with crayon drawings of a man in work clothes fixing cars. The essay inside read, "My daddy is my hero because he fixes broken things and makes them work again. He fixes cars, and he fixed our family when it was broken too." Mike's throat tightened as he read his daughter's words. 3 years ago, when Sarah's funeral had left him drowning in grief and single parenthood, he'd wondered if he was making the right choices. Corporate salary versus honest work, Chicago penthouse versus small-town stability, the endless pressure of executive life versus being present for every scraped knee and bedtime story. Emma's simple words confirmed what his heart had known all along. Some things were more valuable than stock options. As he walked toward the parking lot, Mike noticed a familiar figure standing near the school's main entrance. Katherine Sterling stood beside a black rental car, studying the brick building with the same analytical expression she'd once reserved for market research reports. She seemed out of place among the minivans and SUVs of Cedar Falls families, yet something about her posture suggested she wasn't entirely uncomfortable. When she spotted Mike, she offered a tentative wave that felt both professional and personal. "Coincidence?" Mike asked, approaching her with Emma's artwork still tucked under his arm. Katherine's smile held a complexity he couldn't quite read. "Not exactly. I'm in town on business and I remembered you mentioning parent-teacher conferences. I was curious about—" She gestured toward the school, then seemed to reconsider her words. "About how different your life is now." The admission hung between them like a question neither was quite ready to answer. Cedar Falls Diner occupied the corner of Main and 2nd with the stubborn permanence of small-town institutions. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a coffee pot that never went empty. It was the kind of place where strangers became neighbors and neighbors became family. Mike found himself sitting across from Katherine in a back booth, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them while conversations swirled around topics they'd both been avoiding. "You look happy," Katherine said finally, her fingers tracing patterns on the Formica tabletop. "I mean genuinely happy, not the kind of happiness you fake for board presentations." Mike studied her face, noting the exhaustion behind her perfectly applied makeup, the way her shoulders carried tension like armor. "And you look tired," he replied gently. "The kind of tired the sleep doesn't fix." Katherine's laugh held no humor. 3 years as CEO will do that to you, especially when you inherit a company that's bleeding money and expects miracles. The conversation drifted toward safer territory. Emma's school achievements, the peculiar charm of Cedar Falls, the way small-town life moved at a different rhythm than corporate America. But underneath the pleasant small talk, larger questions lingered. What brought Katherine to Iowa? Why now? And why did her presence stir up feelings Mike thought he'd buried alongside his former life? As Katherine excused herself to take a phone call, Mike watched her step outside into the fading afternoon light, her voice carrying the authoritative tone he remembered from strategy meetings. Some people changed geography, but geography didn't always change people. When Katherine returned to the table, her expression had shifted from casual conversation to business mode. "I should probably be honest about why I'm here," she said, settling back into the booth with visible reluctance. "Sterling Industries is conducting a comprehensive review of our regional operations. The Cedar Falls manufacturing facility is part of that review." Mike's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The factory employed nearly 200 people, fathers and mothers, high school graduates and community college students, folks who'd worked the same jobs their parents had worked before them. "Review," Mike repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "That's corporate speak for closing, isn't it?" Katherine's silence answered his question more eloquently than words. Around them, the diner's familiar sounds continued. Silverware clinking against plates, quiet conversations, the hiss of the grill, but Mike felt as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. This wasn't coincidence or nostalgia that had brought Katherine to Cedar Falls. This was business, and business in Katherine's world rarely had happy endings for small towns. That evening, Mike stood in his small garage workshop, surrounded by projects that most people would call junk. Discarded car parts, twisted metal scraps, tools inherited from his father, the detritus of a life spent fixing things other people had given up on. But in Mike's hands, these forgotten pieces became something else entirely. Tonight he worked on a sculpture crafted from transmission gears and brake rotors, his welding torch painting shadows on the walls as sparks danced like fireflies in the darkness. The piece was taking shape, something abstract yet familiar, like hope built from wreckage. Mike had discovered this passion by accident 2 years ago, when grief and insomnia had driven him to his workshop at 3 a.m. What started as mindless tinkering had evolved into something approaching art, though he'd never used that word aloud. Cedar Falls wasn't the kind of place where mechanics were called artists, and Mike wasn't the kind of man who needed fancy labels for things that brought him peace. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Through the workshop's single window, Mike saw Katherine standing in his driveway, looking uncertain and slightly cold in her business attire. He set down his torch, removed his safety mask, and opened the side door. "It's late," he said, not unkindly, "and you're not exactly dressed for garage tours." Katherine stepped inside anyway, her eyes immediately drawn to the sculptures scattered throughout the space. Her expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching amazement. "Mike, these are—" She moved closer to examine a piece, crafted from chrome bumpers and headlight assemblies, her fingers hovering just above the polished metal surface. "These are incredible. How long have you been doing this?" Mike shrugged, suddenly self-conscious about the oil stains on his clothes and the rough condition of his hands. "Couple years. It's just a hobby. Helps me think." But Katherine was studying the sculptures with the intensity she'd once reserved for market analysis, and Mike could practically see the gears turning in her mind. "This isn't hobby work," she said firmly. "This is sophisticated artistic vision. The composition, the use of industrial materials, the way you've balanced form and function. Mike, this is gallery-quality art." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Katherine, I fix cars for a living in a town most people can't find on a map. I'm not an artist. I'm just a guy who welds scrap metal because he can't sleep." But even as he spoke the words, Mike could see something different in Katherine's eyes. The same look she'd worn when she'd spotted a breakthrough strategy or identified an untapped market. She was seeing possibilities he couldn't imagine. The next morning brought news that spread through Cedar Falls like smoke from a grass fire. The Sterling Industries factory would close within 30 days, effective immediately after the next board meeting. 200 jobs eliminated, families facing uncertain futures, a community watching its economic foundation crumble like autumn leaves. Mike heard the news from Murphy, who'd heard it from his wife, who'd heard it from her sister who worked in the factory's administrative office. Bad news traveled fast in small towns. Mike found himself standing outside the factory gates during the lunch break, watching workers emerge with the particular expression of people processing life-changing information. These weren't statistics or profit margins. They were neighbors, friends, the people who coached Little League and volunteered at the annual corn festival. Mrs. Rodriguez's husband worked quality control. The young woman who bagged groceries at the IGA worked second shift. The man who'd taught Emma to ride her bicycle worked in maintenance. Katherine appeared beside him without warning, her presence both expected and unwelcome. "You knew this was coming," Mike said, not looking at her. "That's why you're here, to oversee the closure." Katherine nodded slowly, her expression carefully neutral. "The board made the decision 6 months ago. I'm just here to implement it." Mike finally turned to face her, and she was struck by the controlled anger in his eyes. "Implement it, like it's a software update instead of people's lives. You think I enjoy this?" Katherine's voice carried an edge he hadn't heard in their previous conversations. "You think I wake up excited about destroying communities?" Mike's laugh was harsh. "I think you've forgotten what communities are. I think you see spreadsheets instead of people." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Katherine's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Around them, factory workers drifted back toward the building, their conversations subdued, their movements heavy with uncertainty. "Come back to Chicago," Katherine said suddenly. "Help me find alternatives. You understand both sides of this, corporate strategy and community impact. Maybe we can figure out something that saves jobs and satisfies the board." Mike stared at her as if she'd suggested he sprout wings and fly. "I can't leave, Emma. I can't leave this life I've built." Katherine's expression softened slightly. "Then watch me destroy everything you care about here. Because that's what's going to happen, Mike. With or without your help." That evening, Mike sat on his front porch watching Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, her laughter a counterpoint to the weight settling in his chest. The house was small but solid. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and Saturday morning pancakes. It wasn't much by Chicago standards, but it was theirs. Safe, stable, everything he'd wanted to give his daughter after losing everything else that mattered. "Daddy, why do you look sad?" Emma settled beside him on the porch swing, her small hand finding his. Mike pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of childhood, playground dirt and strawberry shampoo, and the particular sweetness of 8-year-old optimism. "Just thinking about grown-up stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Emma was too perceptive for easy reassurance. "Is it about the pretty lady? Mrs. Rodriguez says her husband might lose his job at the factory." Mike's chest tightened. Emma attended school with children whose parents faced uncertain futures, and kids had a way of absorbing adult anxieties even when adults tried to shield them. "Sometimes," Mike said carefully, "people have to make really hard decisions. And sometimes those decisions affect other people in ways we don't want." Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "Like when you decided we should live here instead of the big city?" Mike nodded, surprised by her insight. "Exactly like that." Mike began. The following week brought an unexpected crisis that would change everything. Mike was installing a new exhaust system on a 1998 Chevrolet when the hydraulic lift malfunctioned, pinning him beneath the vehicle's undercarriage. Murphy found him 20 minutes later, conscious but trapped, his left leg clearly broken and his face pale with pain and shock. The Cedar Falls Volunteer Fire Department responded within minutes, but extracting Mike required careful coordination and equipment that pushed the small-town emergency response team to their limits. Emma was in her after-school art program when the call came. Mrs. Rodriguez drove her to the hospital, where they found Mike in the emergency room being treated for a fractured femur and mild concussion. He was alive, alert, and making jokes about the quality of hospital coffee, but Emma dissolved into tears at the sight of her father hooked up to monitoring equipment. The incident forced Mike to confront a reality he'd been avoiding. What would happen to Emma if something serious happened to him? News of Mike's accident spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency of small-town communication networks. Neighbors brought casseroles, Murphy organized a rotation of mechanics to cover Mike's workload. Mrs. Rodriguez arranged childcare for Emma. The community that Katherine was preparing to dismantle rallied around one of their own with the automatic generosity that defined small-town life. It was a demonstration of social bonds that no corporate manual could quantify or replicate. Katherine appeared in Mike's hospital room on the second day, carrying flowers that looked professionally arranged and awkwardly expensive. She seemed uncertain about hospital etiquette, unsure whether to sit or stand, formal or casual. "I heard about the accident," she said simply. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Mike gestured toward the bed, the cast, the IV line. Define okay, but his tone held less anger than their previous encounters, as if physical pain had temporarily displaced emotional barriers. "Emma's been asking about you," Mike said after Katherine had settled into the visitor's chair. "She calls you the pretty lady and wonders why you always look sad when you talk to me." Katherine's composure wavered slightly. "I'm not sad. She searched for the right word. "I'm conflicted. This place, these people, it's not what I expected." Mike studied her face, noting the way her fingers worried the edge of her purse, the tension in her shoulders. "What did you expect?" "Numbers," Katherine admitted. "Statistics. A failing facility in a declining market that needed to be closed for the greater good of the company." She gestured toward the window, where the view encompassed Main Street's modest storefronts and the tree-lined neighborhoods beyond. "I didn't expect it to feel like home. I didn't expect people to care about each other the way they do here. I didn't expect to remember why I loved working with you in the first place." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Mike shifted in his hospital bed, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. "What happened to us, Kate? We used to be friends before we were colleagues. We used to care about the same things." Katherine's smile was tinged with sadness. "Success happened. Pressure happened. I became someone who could make hard decisions without flinching, and you remained someone who remembered that hard decisions affect real people." "I resigned as CEO yesterday," Katherine said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. Mike's eyes widened, though he remained silent. "I called an emergency board meeting and told them I couldn't oversee the factory closure. I submitted my resignation effective immediately." Mike struggled to process this information. Katherine Sterling had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, had sacrificed personal relationships for professional advancement, had built her entire identity around business success. "Why?" "Because I remembered something I'd forgotten," Katherine replied. "I remembered that some things are more important than quarterly profits. I remembered that communities matter. I remembered that you were right 3 years ago when you chose Emma over everything else." She reached into her purse and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "I've been working on an alternative proposal for the factory. A way to restructure operations, bring in new equipment, create a specialized manufacturing hub that could actually turn a profit." Mike leaned forward despite the protest from his injured leg. "The board will never approve it. They want quick solutions and guaranteed returns." Katherine's smile held a determination he hadn't seen since their early days working together. "They don't have to approve it. I'm buying the facility myself. My personal investment, my risk, my responsibility." The magnitude of her decision began to sink in. Katherine was risking her fortune, her reputation, her future, on a small-town factory that corporate analysis had deemed hopeless. "I need help," Katherine continued. "Someone who understands both business strategy and community dynamics. Someone who can bridge the gap between corporate efficiency and human values." Mike understood the offer implicit in her words, but he also understood the impossibility of accepting it. "I can't leave Cedar Falls. Emma's life is here. My life is here." Katherine nodded, as if she had expected this response. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to stay, to help me turn this place into something better than it was." The proposal Katherine outlined over the following weeks was ambitious and complex, converting the factory from mass production to specialized artisan manufacturing, bringing in equipment for custom metalworking, precision engineering, small batch fabrication, creating partnerships with artists, designers, boutique manufacturers who valued quality over quantity. It was a business model that played to Cedar Falls' strengths: skilled workers, attention to detail, community pride, while addressing market realities that corporate headquarters had ignored. "Your sculptures gave me the idea," Katherine explained during one of their planning sessions in Mike's hospital room. "The way you transform discarded materials into something beautiful and functional, that's exactly what we need to do with the factory. Take something the corporate world considers worthless and turn it into something valuable." She'd brought photographs of Mike's work, along with market research on the growing demand for custom metalwork, architectural elements, artistic installations. The plan required significant investment: new equipment, worker retraining, marketing to entirely different customer bases. Katherine was prepared to fund the initial conversion with her personal savings and severance package, but long-term success would depend on community buy-in and worker commitment. It was a gamble that could fail spectacularly, leaving Katherine financially ruined and the community no better off than before. Mike found himself caught between skepticism and hope. The proposal addressed real problems with innovative solutions, but it also required trust from people who'd been betrayed by corporate promises before. Factory workers, who'd been told their jobs were being eliminated, might not embrace a rescue plan from the same company that had threatened their livelihoods. Katherine needed someone they trusted to vouch for her credibility and commitment. "Why should they believe you?" Mike asked during one of their conversations. "Why should they trust someone who came here to close the factory?" Katherine's answer was simple and direct: "Because you'll be there with me. Because they trust you and you'll make sure I keep my promises." The weight of community responsibility settled on Mike's shoulders like a familiar burden. These were his neighbors, his friends, Emma's teachers and classmates' parents. Their futures were in his hands. The town meeting took place on a cold November evening in the Cedar Falls Community Center, a building that had hosted everything from high school graduations to funeral receptions over its 50-year history. Nearly the entire town showed up: factory workers and their families, local business owners, retirees who'd worked the facility back when it produced farm equipment. Teenagers who understood their post-graduation options were about to change dramatically. Katherine stood before the assembled crowd in jeans and a simple sweater, looking more like a neighbor than a corporate executive. Mike sat in the front row, his casted leg propped on a folding chair, Emma beside him, drawing pictures of the adults talking seriously about grown-up things. The room buzzed with the nervous energy of people whose lives hung in the balance, of financial projections and business plans they couldn't fully understand. "6 months ago," Katherine began, "I came here to close this factory. I had spreadsheets that proved it was unprofitable, market analysis that showed it was unsustainable, board directives that made closure inevitable." Murmurs rippled through the audience, some angry, some resigned, all paying close attention. "But I didn't have something that spreadsheets can't measure. I didn't have understanding of what this place means to all of you." Katherine outlined her proposal with the clarity and confidence that had made her a successful executive, but also with a warmth and sincerity that surprised even Mike. She acknowledged the risks, admitted the uncertainties, and promised only that she would invest everything she had in making the plan work. No guarantees, no corporate doublespeak, just honest commitment to an uncertain future that they would build together. The questions came rapidly and skeptically. How could they trust someone from Sterling Industries? What happened if the new business model failed? Who would really be in charge of daily operations? Katherine answered each question directly, and when she didn't know something, she admitted it. Mike found himself impressed by her honesty and moved by her obvious commitment to making amends for corporate decisions she'd inherited rather than created. When the formal presentation ended, Mike struggled to his feet with the help of his crutches. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, Emma following close behind. 3 years ago, Mike said, his voice carrying easily through the community center, I left a corporate job in Chicago because I decided some things mattered more than money. Family mattered more. Community mattered more. Being present for the people you love mattered more. I know Katherine Sterling, Mike continued. I worked with her for 7 years. I've seen her make hard decisions and live with the consequences. I've also seen her admit when she was wrong and work to make things right. He gestured toward Katherine, who stood listening with visible emotion. She's not perfect. This plan isn't guaranteed, but she's here, risking everything she has, because she believes this community is worth saving. The vote was closer than Katherine had hoped, but decisive enough to move forward. 63% of the factory workers agreed to participate in the retraining program. Local investors pledged additional funding. The city council approved tax incentives for the manufacturing conversion. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was enough to begin the transformation that would either revitalize Cedar Falls or serve as an expensive lesson in the limits of good intentions. Over the following months, the factory underwent a metamorphosis that mirrored the changes in Katherine herself. Obsolete assembly lines were replaced with precision equipment. Workers attended training sessions on custom fabrication, artistic metalworking, quality control for small batch production. Katherine rented a small apartment above the downtown bakery, trading her Chicago penthouse for a place where she could walk to work and know her neighbors' names. Mike's role evolved from skeptical advisor to operational partner. His artistic vision and community connections proved invaluable in bridging the gap between Katherine's business acumen and the workers' practical expertise. Together, they developed product lines that showcased both technical skill and creative innovation. Architectural elements for urban developers, custom sculptures for public spaces, precision components for specialized manufacturers. The transformation wasn't without setbacks. Equipment failures, training delays, customer acquisition challenges, and the constant pressure of financial sustainability tested everyone's commitment. Some workers left for more stable employment elsewhere. Some community members remained convinced that the whole enterprise was an elaborate corporate deception. But slowly, incrementally, the business began to succeed. Emma adapted to the changes in her father's life with the resilience of childhood, though she noticed that he smiled more often and seemed less tired when he came home from work. She also noticed that Katherine had become a regular presence at school events, community gatherings, and their kitchen table on Sunday mornings. The relationship between her father and Katherine remained undefined, not quite friends, not quite business partners, something more complex than either label could capture. 6 months after the factory reopening, Mike stood in the facility's main production area, watching Katherine explain a custom fabrication process to a group of visiting architects. She moved through the workspace with easy familiarity, her expensive suits replaced by practical clothing, her corporate polish tempered by genuine engagement with the work and workers around her. She had found something in Cedar Falls that Chicago had never offered, a sense of purpose that transcended profit margins. "She's happy here," Emma observed, joining Mike near the observation window. "Happier than when she first came." Mike nodded, surprised by his daughter's perceptive assessment. Katherine was happy, in a way that seemed both foreign and natural to someone who'd spent 15 years climbing corporate ladders. She had discovered that success could be measured in community stability, worker satisfaction, and the pride that came from creating something beautiful and lasting. The sculpture that had started this transformation, Mike's piece, crafted from airplane parts collected after the emergency landing, now stood in the factory's main lobby. A plaque beside it read simply, "From crisis to community." It served as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things emerged from the most broken places, that hope could be welded together from the wreckage of failed plans and shattered expectations. That evening, Mike found Katherine in her small apartment, hunched over financial projections and market research that never quite captured the full story of what they were building together. "You know," Mike said, settling into the chair across from her cluttered table, 3 years ago I thought I was running away from everything I'd built with you. Turns out, I was just taking a different path toward the same destination." Katherine looked up from her paperwork, her expression soft with the kind of exhaustion that came from meaningful work rather than corporate pressure. "I used to think success meant conquering markets and maximizing shareholder value," she replied. "Now I think it means knowing that what you're building will still matter after you're gone." She gestured toward the window, where the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled like stars in the Iowa darkness. "This place taught me the difference between profit and prosperity, between growth and progress." The conversation drifted toward shared memories and future plans, the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to trust each other again. No romantic declarations, no dramatic revelations, just the quiet satisfaction of work worth doing and community worth preserving. Outside, Cedar Falls settled into another peaceful evening, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring challenges but also opportunities, problems but also solutions, the endless cycle of small-town life that continued, regardless of corporate strategies or economic pressures. A year later, the Cedar Falls Artisan Manufacturing Cooperative employed 230 people, 30 more than the original factory had supported in its final months. Orders came from across the Midwest, then from national customers who valued quality over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production. The business model that corporate headquarters had deemed impossible was thriving, proving that sometimes the best solutions emerged from the most unlikely partnerships. Mike stood in his workshop on a Saturday morning, Emma beside him learning to operate a small welding torch under careful supervision. Katherine had joined them, her expensive manicure replaced by work gloves and safety gear. Together, they were creating a sculpture for the town square, a memorial to resilience, crafted from materials that represented Cedar Falls' industrial heritage and artistic future. The sculpture was taking shape slowly, built from pieces contributed by community members who wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. Farm equipment from the original factory, car parts from Murphy's garage, architectural elements from downtown renovations, metal flowers created by local children in the after-school program Katherine had helped establish. It was becoming a physical representation of everything they'd built together. Beautiful, functional, permanent. "You know what I've learned?" Emma said, her voice muffled by her safety mask but clear in its conviction. "Sometimes broken things can be fixed, and sometimes they can be made into something even better than they were before." Mike and Katherine exchanged glances over her head, both understanding that Emma was talking about more than just metal sculptures and factory equipment. As the morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across Main Street and illuminating the hills beyond, the three figures in the workshop continued their work. No grand speeches about transformation or redemption, no dramatic declarations about love conquering corporate greed, just the steady rhythm of creation, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the quiet knowledge that some stories don't end so much as evolve into new beginnings. The sculpture would be completed by spring, unveiled during the annual Corn Festival that celebrated both Cedar Falls' agricultural heritage and its manufacturing future. It would stand as a reminder that communities like art could be built from broken pieces and discarded dreams, that hope was always possible for those willing to weld it together one careful joint at a time. And in the growing light of another Iowa morning, that seemed like enough, more than enough, for any story worth telling.